Okay, well, I guess we're ready to start. I don't know how the acoustics in this room worked, but I can see from David Bosco's grimace he can sort of hear me. So that's all just fine. This is a launch of this terrific book, biasing Mac's response already, Terrorism and National Security Reform, written by Jordan Tama, published by Cambridge University Press. It's a book about commissions and how, and the message of this book is that commissions that some people thought were just icing on the cake actually can drive policy reform. Jordan will talk more about it when he makes his presentation, and Mac will comment on what Jordan has to say and what he knows about the book. I think everyone here probably knows Jordan Tama. Jordan is, for the record, an assistant professor in the School of International Service. This is his second year. He finished his doctorate at the Woodrow Wilson School. Prior to that, he had worked for Lee Hamilton, both at the Wilson Center and in the various commissions work that Lee was doing. So Jordan had had some practical experience with this as well as doing his dissertation on it. He's here at the school working on U.S. foreign policy. And I'm going to introduce Mac right now rather than waiting until Jordan finishes his presentation. Mac Dessler is someone I've known for a very, very long time, and I've known him since I read his book published in 1972, Presidents, Bureaucrats, and Foreign Policy, which is no longer even listed on his brief biography, but is sort of a landmark book about foreign policy making that people read over and over again. I think of Mac as sort of a twin, that there's him and there's his brother. One of them is at the Peterson Institute and the other's at the University of Maryland, because Mac is so active both in the political analysis of policy making and also in the political economy of how it works, that I'm always wondering, is it really just one person or is it two people in these two different institutions? So Mac has an appointment in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland and also at the Peterson Institute. And he's one of the most collegial people in town, in addition to someone who really focuses on issues in very provocative and interesting ways. It's great to have you here, Mac, to have you comment on Jordan's book, and to have you see our new building.
Thank you, Lou. I think I'll leave now because that was that's good introduction.
So, great. So that introduction,
somebody like Bob Pastor knows the real truth, so I may not stay too long. Much longer.
Great. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Jordan.
Thank you, Lou. I'm really excited to be launching my book here, and grateful to Lou for that introduction and for his support as I was working on this book, and I'm grateful to Mac for taking the time to join us today and to offer comments on the book. I'm going to give a kind of overview of the book. And to start, what's the motivation for the book? Well, the commissions are a staple of U.S. politics, blue ribbon commissions, but there's been very little research on them, and so this raised the question to me of what role do commissions really play in politics, and that's the question that I set out to answer. And there's a conventional wisdom about commissions which is pretty straightforward, that they are devices to deflect political pressure, to pass the buck, to avoid blame, but that their reports don't have any real impact, that the reports just gather dust on bookshelves. I think that's the most common cliche about commissions. And in my book, I did a systematic investigation of whether this is really true or whether commissions have some important impact on policy. And what is a blue ribbon commission? The kind of commission I'm talking about has a few important characteristics. One is it's an ad hoc body, meaning it's a temporary body. I'm not talking about permanent institutions, permanent commissions like the Federal Trade Commission or the Securities and Exchange Commission. And I'm only talking about commissions in the U.S. political context, first of all. Second, commission has to have at least two members. At least one of these people has to be a private citizen, someone who's not a regular government official. This is what distinguishes a commission from a regular government institution. And third, the commission doesn't have any formal policy-making power. This again distinguishes a commission from a permanent regular institution of government. These commissions only have advisory power. They are only going to have an impact if they persuade someone else to act on their recommendations. And the research questions I asked in this book are, first, do many commissions actually influence policy? is the conventional wisdom right or not? Second, in what circumstances can commissions drive policy change? And third, what gives commissions the ability to drive policy change? In other words, what's so special about commissions? If they do sometimes have an impact, what's special about them that enables them to induce policy changes that wouldn't otherwise occur? And my argument in a nutshell is first that many commissions do actually prompt reform, so the conventional wisdom is wrong. Second, that crises are the most important condition that enable commissions to have an impact or make it more likely that commissions will drive reform. I'll say a bit more about this in a minute. And third, that political credibility is the key source of commission power. This is what's special about commissions and enables them to drive policy changes. So to say a bit more about the conditions in which commissions are likely to drive policy changes, the most important condition is the existence of a crisis. And I define a crisis as a moment of heightened political pressure stemming from an unexpected event. And I actually thank Matt for pressing me to define a crisis more precisely and comments he gave me on an earlier version of the book. What happens in a crisis? Why is a crisis important for a commission? Well, in the absence of a crisis, it's really hard to change the status quo in policymaking in the United States or really in any political system. And commissions that are created and operate in a issue area where there's not a crisis tend not to have a significant impact. When there's a crisis, though, there's a window of opportunity for reform that's created, and commissions can take advantage of this. And the reason is because when there's a crisis, policymakers face pressure to make some changes. And when the commission reports, it can shape what those changes actually are. And the reason why a commission can still be necessary when there's a crisis is even when there's a crisis, there's pressure on policymakers to make changes, but there's always, or almost always, obstacles to reform at the same time, entrenched interests or actors in the government who resist certain changes. And the commission can help advocates of reform overcome those obstacles to reform by providing a focal point for the reform debate. There are a couple of other conditions that are important in making commissions more likely to drive reform. I'm not going to say much about them here for the sake of time, but commissions are more likely to have impact when they're formed by the executive branch rather than Congress, and when their mandate is kept relatively narrow. The other question that I think is important is what about commissions is special, and I mentioned briefly earlier, political credibility. What do I mean by political credibility? Political credibility is an attribute that derives from three features of commissions that, as a combination, are distinct. These are independence, stature, and bipartisanship. So commissions are created to operate independently of the permanent institutions of government. The members of commissions are often people of high stature, and commissions almost always have a bipartisan membership. There are Republicans and Democrats on them, often an even number of Republicans and Democrats. And the combination of these characteristics is distinct. Other political institutions don't have this combination of characteristics. And bipartisanship is especially important because when commissions then issue a unanimous report, it sends a powerful signal to the policy community that its recommendations are ones that a wide range of political actors can also support. Commissions do this often. They have a unusually good ability to reach consensus, to issue unanimous reports. So most commissions actually issue unanimous final reports. In a database I created, I found this to be the case, that 2/3 of the commissions issued unanimous reports. This is very different from, for instance, a congressional committee, which congressional committees hardly ever are unanimous on legislation. And commissions have a special ability to reach consensus because of a couple attributes about them that are distinct. They are comprised of people often who are retired from active political life or quasi-retired, people who are not serving in government, and as a result they those people are freed from partisan pressures to some extent and tend to be more willing to sort of make compromises with other people than active elected officials tend to be. And also commissions have a deliberative environment that facilitates reaching consensus. They deliberate in a private setting that's insulated from politics. Again, very different from, say, Congress, where congressional committees rarely engage in actual deliberation, serious deliberation. Everything they do is highly political. So the upshot is that commissions issue unanimous reports often. When they do so, this sends a strong signal to the policy world that their recommendations are ones that Republicans and Democrats can support, because there are Republicans and Democrats on the commission. So in the book, I also test a couple of alternative explanations for alternative explanations of the impact of commissions. These are explanations that I don't favor myself, but they're plausible alternative explanations of commission influence. One is that expertise is what's special about commissions, that commissions are influential because they have a special kind of expertise. And the second explanation, the second alternative, is that commissions don't actually have real impact, that the apparent impact of commissions is illusory. When the president or some other policymaker endorses a commission's proposals, it's not because the commission convinced that policymaker to change their mind, or that the policymaker is doing anything they wouldn't otherwise do. They're just doing what they plan to do anyway and giving lip service to the commission. So those are alternatives that I also investigate in my book. And so I test my argument about commissions and these alternative arguments by looking at data I collected. I created a database of all the commissions that have dealt with national security issues in the US since the beginning of the Reagan administration. And this is 51 commissions. And for each of these commissions, I created a couple of measures of their impact to assess how much impact they had. One of these measures is whether their principal recommendations were adopted by the government within a couple of years. And the other is how people who know the most about these commissions, people who served on the commissions as commissioners or staff members, or people who were in the government when these commissions were operating, either in the executive branch or Congress, and were working on the issues that the commission dealt with, how these people rate the impact of the commissions. And these ratings are not ones that I expect to be objective. People will have biases. If someone served on a commission, they might be more likely to think the commission was influential. So when I use this data, I control for possible biases among respondents to those questions. And then in my book, I do statistical analysis of this data set, and I also do case studies of 8 of the commissions that looked at terrorism. And this gives the book a thematic focus on counterterrorism policy, US counterterrorism policy over the last 3 decades. And my analysis draws on many interviews that I conducted, over 200 interviews of people who were part of the commissions or were working in Congress or the executive branch on the issues that the commissions dealt with, as well as looking back at congressional records, executive branch documents, and other sources. And the main findings I reached from my research were that commissions do have much more impact when they're created in the context of a crisis, when they're created by the executive branch rather than Congress, when their scope is relatively narrow, and that what the commission actually does is also very important. So some commissions are able to issue a unanimous report, others aren't. The ones that issue a unanimous report are more influential, as my argument would suggest, and also commissions that promote their report aggressively are more influential than commissions that don't engage in a sort of intensive advocacy campaign. And I also found that credibility, political credibility, rather than expertise, is the main source of commission power. And my case studies show that commissions have had an important impact on US counterterrorism policy over the past 3 decades, an impact that I think is underappreciated. So just to very quickly give you a flavor of a couple of commissions that have been important since 9/11. One is a commission called the Hart-Rudman Commission. This was a commission chaired by 2 former senators, Gary Hart, a Democrat, and Warren Rudman, a Republican. It issued a final report in early 2001, just as the Bush administration was taking office, and the report had one top finding and one top recommendation on the first page of the report. The finding was that the United States is likely to experience an attack on its homeland in the coming years, and that the United States government doesn't have any coherent or integrated structures in place to prepare for such an attack or prevent such an attack. And the Commission recommended creating a Homeland Security Agency to make the government more coordinated, integrated, and better able to prevent this kind of attack. And the report got hardly any attention before 9/11, but after 9/11, when there was a crisis, journalists dug up the report, wrote articles about this commission, which seemed really prescient, seemed like this commission had predicted 9/11, and policymakers became interested in it. And one senator in an important position took up the Homeland Security Agency idea. Joe Lieberman, who was the chairman of the Senate Government Affairs Committee at the time, called Hardin Rudman to testify before his committee right after 9/11 in the first hearing he held after 9/11. Hardin Rudman were the first witnesses at this hearing. They made their case for creating a Homeland Security Agency. Lieberman liked the idea, and very soon after that wrote and introduced legislation based directly on the Commission's proposal to create a Homeland Security Agency. This legislation started to advance in Congress. It was voted out of that committee, and as it advanced, the Bush administration decided to change its position on this issue. The Bush administration initially was against creating a Homeland Security Agency, preferred to coordinate Homeland Security policy out of the White House, but not to create a new agency or department. But the Lieberman bill was likely to pass in Congress, in the House and Senate, and the Bush administration didn't want to be on the defense on this issue. And as a way of kind of regaining the initiative on this issue, they decided to endorse and come out with their own proposals for creating a Homeland Security Department. And that's why we have DHS across the street. Whether you think having a Homeland Security Department is a good or a bad idea is something we can debate, but the important thing from the perspective of a commission is that we might not have this department were it not for a commission, because it was the commission that inspired a senator to introduce legislation based on its ideas, and that's what led the Bush administration to come up with its own proposal. And one congressional aide I interviewed about this said to me simply, if the commission didn't exist, the department wouldn't exist, referring to DHS. I'm not going to say as much about the 9/11 Commission. That's a commission that's probably more well known to many of you. It also had a big impact after 9/11 on legislation. It was the very direct cause of the most significant intelligence reform legislation that has been passed not just in the past decade, but in the past 5 or 6 decades. This was legislation that created the Director of National Intelligence to manage the intelligence community, also created a National Counterterrorism Center, created mechanisms for promoting information sharing across government agencies, and this legislation would not have been enacted without the 9/11 Commission. One point to just underscore about this is that there was also a congressional investigation of 9/11. And this is interesting because it points to how a commission can actually be more powerful than a congressional investigation. Right after 9/11, the House and Senate Intelligence Committees carried out their own investigation of 9/11. This was just done by the members and staff of those congressional committees. And this investigation uncovered many of the same problems, shortcomings in government operations that the 9/11 Commission later found. But that congressional investigation, which was called a joint inquiry, had very little or no impact on policy. Its recommendations, it made recommendations, didn't really go anywhere. That was mainly because the joint inquiry itself was driven by partisanship. Its final report had 8 dissenting statements totaling 200 pages. Media coverage focused on all these dissents, which some of them were motivated just by partisanship or conflicting interests among these members of Congress. And the report, as a result, didn't really drive reform. The 9/11 Commission was unanimous, bipartisan, and it did drive reform. And that, I think, points to the power of commissions. So just to sum up, in conclusion, a couple points to leave you with. Commissions do more than we tend to think. They don't just provide damage control for politicians, although they do that. And I'm not arguing that they are not devices to deflect political pressure. But there's a second part of the story. Many of these same commissions that are created to deflect political pressure ultimately have a major impact on policy. And commissions have shaped important elements of U.S. counterterrorism policy to a degree that I don't think many people appreciate over the past 3 decades. And commissions are, I think, actually increasingly valuable in our political system because we're in a political system in the U.S. where partisanship and polarization are increasingly powerful. And what commissions excel at is creating bipartisan consensus solutions to policy problems, and there's more and more of a need for that because of the growth of partisanship and polarization in our system. Commissions aren't going to solve every problem, but they are one of the best tools to help overcome those tendencies. So with that, I'll stop and turn it over to Matt.
Thank you very much, Jordan, and thank you and Lou for having me here. I want to clarify one thing, Lou. I do have an academic brother. That's the good news, I guess. The bad news in terms of productivity in this particular area is he's now president of the Rochester Institute of Technology. He's an engineer, and so he doesn't contribute directly to my work on either international security policy or national economic policy. I want to also...
we're also partnering with him on a new project for the disabled. We're starting the first master's degree on comparative and international disabilities policy. And one of his subunits is partnering with SIS to do that.
Is that because they are the second most important university for deaf Americans?
It is, that
unit.
Yeah,
that's what I think.
So you might mention to him that we...
I will do that.
Fondly
I will say that. Okay. So he did note there was another name. One interesting story about the Department of Homeland Security. After 9/11, I'm getting a couple of telephone calls from congressional committees, including that committee where I did testify also, and said, you write about national security. Homeland Security must be like that. Aren't you an expert on that? And I started out by saying, no, I think it's very different. But then after 2 or 3 people call you up and say you're an expert, you, of course, played it a little bit, so you decide you are an expert. And so we went down and tested. So Ivo Daldner and I, who had been planning and finally did publish this book on presidential national security advisors, we got sort of diverted like a lot of people and looking at Homeland Security, how should the government be structured? And so we gave this lucid testimony, which was later published in June of 2002 in a very eloquent, I think, totally persuasive article saying the problem was not consolidation, but coordination. There was no way to bring all the Homeland Security agencies together, and what you really needed was not the Bush administration structure was right, but they hadn't run it right at all. They didn't seem to understand the types of tools you could use and run it. So we published this brilliant article in a nationally visible journal. The same day that it was officially published, the president, I'm sure he read the article totally, and decided to go against the position that he had been in, which we were supporting, and to endorse the department. So that just shows, that's one of many examples I could show of the enormous influence that my writings have, but usually in the direction opposite from what I argue. I want to start, though, by going back a little bit further in my life, actually, to less than 2 years out of graduate school. I got to work for a commission. It was even prior to the Murphy Commission that Bob Pastor and I met or were connected to, which was the best, at least the best foreign policy process research program, I think, in the history of the United States. But it was called the President's Task Force on Government Organization. And it wasn't bipartisan, because I'm sure, having read the book, that's one of the reasons it didn't work, so it wasn't effective, but it was brilliant. It had people like George Bundy, Robert McNamara, Kermit Gordon, the former budget director, then president of Brookings, the Charlie Schultz, all just, these sort of vintage people, and it was a wonderful experience. It changed my life because it got me for the first time to think that governmental organization and process were actually interesting. I didn't think they were interesting when I was I wasn't interested in them, particularly when I was a master's student. But I found that there was some logic to this process, and that's one of the things I like about Jordan in his book is that not only does he tackle this subject, I think, in a very persuasive way, but he has a sense, I think, he's developed a nice sense, or maybe he had it to begin with, about how process works and what both the importance and the limits of process and structures, and he has millions of testing and evaluating. But I think that now, there have been several people at AU, actually, who are, this has been something of an area of strength, I think, at this school. But it's not, that expertise, that emphasis is not, I don't want to mention other places where I think in town where it's not strong, but I think it's anyway, had I known about this analysis, which would have been difficult in 1967, I would have concluded that this wasn't really a crisis, even though people thought it was a crisis of governance because we had all these new great society domestic programs and the old government wasn't fit to run them. And I wouldn't have, I would say, well, it was created by the executive, but it's another reason maybe it wouldn't have been effective was that it was secret, and therefore it didn't have the sort of type of impact that people could point to and mobilize for it. But I thought the proximate cause was that Lyndon Johnson reportedly, I wasn't there alas, looked at the report, heard about it, said this is absolutely wonderful, and he stuck it in his drawer to deal with in his next term. For those of you, few of you are around then, but some of you probably from your studies know that Lyndon Johnson didn't run for a next term, but it was, as I say, a wonderful. It literally changed my life in the sense of getting a sense of how government process worked. Now, but the fate was typical of what people think of commissions. There is a joke which Lloyd Cutler, who perhaps next to Roy Lee Hamilton was might, if one did a census, might have been the member of more commissions than almost anybody else. This Washington, late now Washington super lawyer, and he told us the story about the office holder, maybe it's a president who's leaving office, and his successor asks him for his advice, and he says, here are three envelopes, open them in order. When you have a big problem, open the first one, and then when you you can deal with it. Then it'll go away, and then when you have the second one, open that envelope, then the problem will go away. Who knows the joke, but anyway. Then the third problem, open the third envelope. So the first envelope you open up, it says, blame your predecessor. So he does it, goes away. So he's happy. Then about 2.5 years into the term, a big problem. So he opens the thing and says, appoint a commission. Relevant, get the relevance. And then the third, then that works, diffuses the problem, puts it aside according to the conventional wisdom again, and then the third thing, you open the envelope. Third crisis, you open the envelope, says, prepare 3 envelopes. Anyway, that's in this book actually, but he credits me with the joke. So I told him when I came over, I said, I want the joke. You can't. I don't want you to tell the joke. I want to tell the joke. Anyway, I think, let me just say a few more serious things about the book, which I really do think is very good, very, very interesting. I think it's wonderful how somebody can find an important subject like this that people haven't really studied, and to do a very nice, I'd say sophisticated, but quite straightforward and sensible approach to analyzing it. Develop some data, do interviews. I'm awed by the notion of 209 interviews. I've certainly done more than that during my lifetime, but I certainly haven't done that many for any single book. But I think, the combination of using some carefully put together data and doing qualitative research, I think is very productive. I think a lot of rising scholars are doing this now, and it's something that I've only done seldom myself, but I really recognize. Anyway, I think the propositions are generally persuasive. Commissions formed in response to a crisis, established by the executive, given a narrow mandate. Well, I'm not absolutely certain, as I said to him in my comments, exactly what constitutes a narrow mandate. But I think it's done nicely, it's written well, and so forth. So I'm delighted, therefore, to find a colleague somewhat separated by geography and certainly by generation, who has a real sense of how policy processes actually work and uses this to, I think, do some really useful and interesting analysis. There are some things I would like more about. One interesting commission actually called a board, the Tower Board, after the Iran-Contra crisis. It's in his database, apparently, and so it's, but he doesn't talk about it. I happen to think that's a particularly interesting case, because the Reagan administration was literally literally dying in early 1987 after the Iran-Contra scandal. The president was in terrible shape. The credibility of the president's public opinion support dropped by a larger number of points in a month, I think, any time a president has happened before or since. And this commission, together with other things, together with quick response and quick restaffing of his government, was extremely useful. And it also had, I think, some significant influence. I'm sure the data, in terms of your data set, it reflects this. But it would be interesting. I know you can't use all cases, and I'm not saying that the other Scowcroft Commission on the MX missile wasn't in some respects just as important, but anyway, I thought that I would like to see more about this. Let me say one other thing which reflects a little bit of this kind of an expansion of some comments I made about the book that I think is worth looking for. When you look about, when you ask lots of questions about how to influence policy, and when you talk about it as an individual trying to influence policy within a government, when you talk about a negotiator for a government trying to influence policy by another government, obviously, the timeliness, the lucidity, the sense of crisis, a lot of things play. But one very important thing is whether there are people in the entity that you want to influence who want to do it, or want to do something like that for their own reasons, whether there is already internal support. As an intermittent scholar of U.S.-Japanese relations, people developed this term, and it's a Japanese word, Americans discovered it, I discovered it about 30 years ago, called gaiatsu, which essentially means gaijin is foreign. So it's foreign pressure. And Japanese talk about this as something that they have to, in some circumstances, yield to. But it's also a game, because it doesn't work unless there are important figures within the Japanese government who want a policy change, but who need some excuse or some urgent reason for doing so, that in this case the foreign pressure provides. So it seems to me it would have been useful, and maybe it's an interesting follow-up project for you or maybe one of your PhD students, to look at, maybe in the context of commissions, maybe in the context of some other entity, to look at, is the change something that either within the community that would act on it, or within the important parts of the Congress or whatever? Is it something that was already around, maybe? It was an idea that already had support, or it was something that a certain unit would either in advance or immediately thereafter see it as it's either consistent with its policy principles or consistent with its interests in carrying out? Would this be something that would that you could? It seems to me, obviously, doors that are open are easier to open, or doors that are unlocked are easier to open. And so I think that would be one thing I would say one could think about in terms of whether you could, how you would score this is a little bit difficult. I mean, you would have to be based importantly on interviews, and it would have to relate to the questions you asked. But I think that would be one thing you could usefully, or you or someone in subsequent research could look at. I could talk further. I could tell you all the terrible things that are wrong with the book, but unfortunately, as even though I might be two people, I don't want to contradict myself, and that kind of indicated on the back of the book is thinking it's a good thing. So I think I will now stop and begin my congratulations to Jordan for his publication.
Well, Mac, thanks very much. Gordon, do you want to respond at all, or do you want to have questions first?
Sure, I'll respond to a couple of points because Mac raised a couple of very interesting issues. The Tower Board is a really interesting commission, and I didn't do a case study of it because I only focused on the terrorism commissions in my case studies. This is a commission that had a very big political impact in terms of saving Reagan, helping to save Reagan's presidency, really, and helping to prevent him from getting impeached, since it allowed Reagan to say that he was investigating what went wrong with Iran-Contra, and the commission itself didn't directly blame Reagan for Iran-Contra, although it said that there was poor management. It didn't say that he had directly authorized anything.
He criticized him more for inattention and neglect of duty rather than
right.
Sins of omission rather than commission. Right, exactly.
So that kind of helped save him politically. So it was useful to him, but it did have an impact on policymaking because it made some recommendations about how to run the National Security Council, and it basically set out a model for how the National Security Council should be run. And Frank Carlucci was at that point coming in as a new national security advisor, and he essentially took that model and adopted it as the sort of model that he would follow as a national security advisor for the NSC. So it did actually have an impact.
And it actually been more or less continued by subsequent national security advisors.
And then on the other point you raised about whether commission ideas already have support within the government before they come out. I think usually they do have support somewhere in the government, and what they do is create more support for it. And so I think often a commission idea is not usually a new idea, but it's an idea that has support somewhere, but it doesn't have enough support to get approved, adopted as government policy yet. And the commission can sometimes help tip the balance in favor of that idea.
Great. Sharon, would you like to start out? And if people don't know, this is Sharon Weiner, who's a member of our faculty.
Jordan, this was great. I'm actually partially through the book now, so thank you very much for doing a lot of work for something that I wouldn't have actually known to look at, and I'm really glad you did. So thank you. So my question is actually a riff off of one of Professor Benson, a slightly different focus. This comes from the notion of sort of public administration. And that's that there are answers to questions that relate to the question and how to solve it, and then there are just answers that somehow find questions. They used to call this garbage can theory. Our favorite answers, and they're looking for problems to solve, as opposed to vice versa. And so to that extent, I'm wondering, maybe there are people that are lobbying for answers and commissions adopt that, but could it also be the case that commissions, when they propose something, actually serve to truncate the search for rational answers to problems?
Yes, absolutely. So there's in my book, I really kept my focus limited to the question of, do commissions induce policy changes that wouldn't otherwise occur? And I set aside the question of whether the ideas proposed by commissions are the good ones or the right ones, or whether the policies that are adopted as a result of commissions are the best policies, make our government more effective, et cetera. And my answer to that is that commission ideas are not necessarily the best ideas, and they can short-circuit a rational process. And in fact, they can do that because of the fact that their authority comes from their political credibility more than their expertise. And so the ideas will get public support, political support, because of the people recommending them, not because people are doing any kind of in-depth study of whether the commission went through a great process for coming up with these ideas. And since the members of commissions are often politicians, they're not always experts. They're not necessarily people who know the most about the issue, but they have an expert staff. The staff is important, and they will know a lot about the issue. But the commission will tend to coalesce around ideas that are politically acceptable, rather than ideas that are necessarily the best ideas. And so this can be a deficiency if you care about the best idea being adopted. I don't think, though, that commissions usually come up with bad ideas. They do have expert staffs, and they also usually want to come up with good ideas. But I completely agree that they can cut short a rational decision-making process in choosing the best policy.
I just add just one comment about that. It's a good question, good answer. I think, of course, if you look at John Kingdon's analysis, you have sort of these three semi-separated areas of activity: the sort of the analysis area, the policy area, and then the politics area. And the big question is sort of why do ideas get adopted? And I think that's, in a sense, a separate question from what are the best ideas. And it's more, ideas being adopted is an exceptional thing in a sense. A lot of ideas are spun around, and the opportunities never just, the politics never coalesces to make it happen. And so then when it happens, the model says there are these ideas available, and that's just what's related, as you say, to the question I asked. But it's a separate and really, in a lot of ways, it's a value as well as a process question to say, were they right? Now, I suppose it is a process question to say, was the 9/11 Commission right about the intelligence reform? There's a lot of people around town who think, no, it was not, that they created a two-headed thing that hasn't really helped. And they pushed very hard for that, and they essentially demanded it in an election year, and everybody sort of went along. So maybe that is arguably questionable on process grounds, assuming everybody wants to have a better intelligence system. But a lot of these issues are kind of substantive or value questions that it's not easy to say what is the right answer or what is the best solution. You know that.
David Bosco, another member of our faculty.
I just wanted to ask, in terms of the process of commissions drafting and producing their ultimate conclusions, to what degree did you find there's actual kind of an informal give and take between the government and the commission, between the White House and the government, the White House and the commission, while the commission is the report is being produced, so that in a sense the policy actors are influencing the outcome of the commission?
Yeah, that's a great question. That can happen a lot. That does happen a lot, especially for commissions created by the president. So there is a difference there, I think, in terms of congressional commissions are not going to tend to be as linked to the White House as a commission created by the president. The administration will generally try to influence the commission in some way. Some commissions, though, end up being quite independent of the people who created them anyway. There are a lot of examples of runaway commissions, which make commissions really fun and interesting. So just to give one example, President Nixon created a commission on marijuana and drug abuse, which reported to him that marijuana should be decriminalized, which was very different from Nixon's own view on marijuana and his political stance on drug use. So that's kind of an extreme example, but there are a lot of commissions that end up recommending things that the people who created them didn't necessarily want, because the people on commissions are people who don't tend to, they're people of sort of distinction who aren't going to tend to just want to do the bidding of the person who created them. But at the same time, commission ideas are often shaped through a process of discussions with government officials. And in many cases, commission ideas can be shaped by conversations with government officials, but that doesn't necessarily mean the commission is still not important. Because what happens sometimes is the president will create a commission, sometimes because he or she or White House officials are hoping that the commission will help them advance an agenda that faces opposition within their own government sometimes. And sometimes presidents will be able to use commissions to kind of push parts of the government, departments, or cabinet secretaries to make changes that were being resisted. So one example of this is there was, in the 1980s, a big defense procurement scandal. the Pentagon had been found to be buying things like toilet seats at really exorbitant prices, very mundane items, and this got a lot of media attention. The White House created a commission led by David Packard, which was the White House created this commission in part to get Secretary Weinberger, who was the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, to make changes that he didn't want to make. And the idea was this commission would come back with proposals, would report directly to President Reagan. Reagan would endorse these proposals, and then the Secretary of Defense would have to do them because because the President has ordered it. Whereas without the commission, the policy changes would never have risen to Reagan's attention. So a commission can be a way to sort of rejigger the policy-making dynamics within the executive branch, and in that case, even if the commission is recommending things that the White House wants, it can still have a real impact on policy.
Tony Quain, another member of our faculty.
Yeah, George, one of the things you haven't talked about are resource allocation. And I'm struck by this, one of the commissions I know something about, the Inland Commission, had some good ideas about fixing embassy security. And yet resources were never provided by Congress at the quantities that Inland said. And of course, a decade later, the Carl Commission going over the same ground again. What's your sense from these commissions live in a world of fiscal reality or budgetary reality? It's just about good ideas that crisis is generating, but sometimes there must be some problems about moving forward because of the resource context.
Right. For the most part, I think commissions don't have their biggest impact by recommending big budget increases for programs. They much more often have an impact by recommending organizational changes. And I think the reason for that is it's harder to get Congress to appropriate some large amount of new money for a program. So if commissions are what commissions are usually very good at is being politically realistic, because the members of commissions are often people with sort of a deep grounding in the political system, often former elected officials or other policymakers. So they don't tend to recommend unrealistic budget proposals, but their recommendations for increased funding are not always going to be approved. And in those cases of the Inman Commission and the Crow Commission, I think the commissions did help gain increased resources for diplomatic security in the near term, within a couple of years. But then after a couple of years, attention on that issue faded and the resources didn't continue to flow.
Gordon Adams, another member of our faculty.
Piggyback directly on the question that Tony just asked in regards is because you do now have two commissions who have reported on budgets specifically. The Simpson-Bowles Commission and the Comanche River Commission. One was private sector think tank based, one of which was appointed by the president.
Right.
And it wasn't in your database because the book was finished before. But do you have any reading on how one would look to the potential consequences of commissions whose task is actually to do something about the distribution of resources?
Yeah, in general, I think it's much harder for a commission to have the kind of impact I'm talking about in terms of driving the enactment of legislation on issues which have significant distributive consequences for Americans. Issues like taxes and spending, where Americans care about that more than any other government issue, and where interests are very entrenched, and it's very hard to move the debate on an issue like taxes and spending. I think it's relatively easier for a commission to influence policy on a lot of national security issues where interest groups don't play as predominant of a role and where the positions of elected officials aren't as deeply entrenched. So on an issue like intelligence reform, most members of Congress before the 9/11 Commission reported didn't really have a position on intelligence reform. It wasn't something they ever thought about. So it was relatively easy for them to endorse the 9/11 Commission's proposals because they didn't conflict with their pre-existing positions. Whereas for these kinds of fiscal commissions, every member of Congress already has a position on tax policy, on Social Security, on Medicare, things like this. And so it's a lot harder, I think, for commissions to lead elected officials to change their position on those issues. But still, what's been interesting with these commissions is that they have still had a real impact on the debate so far, and they remain the best hope for bipartisan consensus on this issue, even though I'm not optimistic that we're going to have some major big agreement on long-term deficit reduction. The members of Congress, as you well know, Gordon, have 6 members of Congress are taking up the President's Fiscal Commission as the basis for their own proposals.
Senators, yeah.
6 senators, right. And that still remains sort of the best hope for bipartisan agreement on that issue.
I wonder, though, given your, Jordan, you're thinking of your timetable, they only, reported, was it November or late November, early December, and this is what then, 5 months we got, or 4 months. It's President used it to a significant degree in terms of his own speech today. So it may well be that, this may turn out to be when...
The gang of 6 in the Senate is also using it.
Exactly. So I think it's going to be. I think it's interesting because it clearly one of the reasons why is we have a quasi crisis. It's not the crisis everybody's predicting someday. As the dollar plunges, the credits, people withdraw money from the United States because they don't become like Greece. It's not that, but we have kind of a political crisis which is forced. Partly, I think, by the new Republican majority in the House more than anything else, which has made it harder to, and I think to give Ryan some credit, pushing a position that I would consider to be outrageous as a final solution, but I think it's very, is certainly substantial and comprehensive, and I think there's a kind of a quasi crisis, as I say. It's part of it. It's been manufactured, and it reflects the very political divisions that you were talking about, the polarization, but that dynamic may, it could. Obviously we don't know, and I think your prediction is better than 50% that we don't get something comprehensive before the 2012 presidential election. Partly because I think Republicans would hope to be able to control all the houses of government and to do things more to their liking. But that being said, I think it may very well, we may get, on the other hand, you hear people say we're not going to do anything about the debt ceiling until we have, apparently the speaker, at least I heard on the radio this afternoon, the speaker said that we weren't doing anything about that until we had a deal about the long-term budget situation. Well, that's an action-forcing process if they stick to it, which I think they won't, but if they do,
You had a question.
Yeah.
Since I don't know you, I need you to identify yourself.
I'm David Carroll from the Department of Government. You said a couple of things that made me think about media coverage. That the 9/11 inquiry by the Congress got more coverage than Hart Rudman because there was conflict. And then you mentioned that Nixon's commission advocated criminalization of marijuana, which I imagine was a good story. But then that was a good story precisely because it was something he didn't want to do. At the same time, one might think that a mechanism of influence of the commission would be media coverage. So what did you find about that topic?
Yeah, I tried to measure this in various ways, but I never came up with a completely satisfying way of measuring how much media coverage drives the impact of commissions, because media coverage is itself largely a function of how much pre-existing interest there was in that issue already. So if there's a lot of media interest in a commission's report, it's not necessarily because of what the commission did, it's often just because there's already a lot of interest in that issue. But what I did find is that commissions that were more successful tended to have their recommendations endorsed more frequently by editorial pages. So I tracked editorials written about commission reports and whether editorials in major newspapers were more positive or negative, whether they were generally endorsing what the commission said or not. And commissions that got more editorial endorsements did tend to be more successful by my other measures. So you're right that commissions can get attention by doing something controversial or having dissenting opinions, but with the joint inquiry, actually, even though there were dissenting opinions, it still got a lot less attention than the 9/11 Commission, which was unanimous. So unanimous commissions can still get a lot of attention also.
So I want to ask you to try to put this phenomenon in comparative context, because the United States is just one country, and the commissions, while they're interesting to look at, are a function of process. And as Max said, having a sense of process and how it works and how you solve problems when there's gridlock or whatever is something of great interest and importance to all of us. So I'm wondering, does this phenomenon exist elsewhere? And also, what is this? What larger set is this a piece of? For example, there is a phenomenon called referenda that have been used in various national contexts to resolve gridlock on certain issues. And in the part of the world that I work in, Latin America, there's lots of national legislatures that are gridlocked. And the governments function through presidential edicts or through temporary mandates. I mean, in Brazil right now, there's 20 different parties in the legislature. They can never get a majority. So they have a temporary presidential mandate that sort of causes things to go on. What happens elsewhere? What is this? What larger set is this a part of? And might these mechanisms that exist in other countries end up being used in the United States if gridlock gets intensified? Big question.
Good. That was a lot of big questions. So I think that first of all, commissions are used elsewhere in quite a few countries, and I would like to have a list of all the countries where commissions are used, but they've been used in Britain going back centuries, and Britain was kind of the innovator of this. In Britain, they're called royal commissions, and they formally report to the Crown. A number of other European countries use commissions often also. Canada uses commissions, Israel uses commissions. There have not been any real comparative studies of this, and it's something that I would love to do, but I, in this project, found quickly that just understanding the U.S. context was as much as I could really do in one dissertation and one book. I actually started out my project thinking that I was going to look at two different kinds of commissions: U.S. Commissions and international commissions, meaning commissions that are not created by any single government, but by the UN, commissions that report internationally and have members from a lot of different countries. And I ended up cutting that off just because it was too much for one project. My expectation, though, is that a lot of what I find would be the same in other countries, because I think, or for an international commission that reports to the UN or another international organization, because I think the heart of my argument has to do with things that are just basic to political dynamics, the way a crisis can shake up a political system, create interest in reform, and how there are always obstacles to changing policy, and how a commission can help provide a focal point for reform efforts. So I would think that those things would be the same elsewhere, and I would love to see studies looking at commissions in other contexts. I think where the study of commission fits in more broadly into existing literature is it fits into a broader literature on how policymaking happens generally, and on how outside advice can influence the policy process. There are other people who have written studies of the influence of think tanks and studies of other kinds of advisory mechanisms. There are many ways that people in government get advice or information from people outside government, and there are other kinds of advisory mechanisms in the government that I didn't look at, permanent commissions, and so it fits within that broader context, I think.
Other questions? Gordon?
Just a follow-up as well, because nobody's jumping in, which is and I'm assuming the BRAC commissions in your database.
They're not because of the fact...
BRAC is kind of different.
They're kind of right.
So I wanted to ask you about what the significant difference there is, because BRAC is actually given a decision role.
Right.
In the government, though it is a commission.
Right, though it is... Right.
Everybody knows what a BRAC commission is?
So these are base realignment and closure commissions, which for those who don't know, have been created to make it easier for Congress to agree to close military bases that are no longer really needed. And there have been a number of these BRAC commissions going back over a couple decades that have recommended base closures. And why they're useful is because these commissions will recommend base closures, and then Congress can't tinker with their proposals. They have to just accept them or reject them, which makes it a lot more likely that Congress will actually accept the recommendation. And I don't look at them because of the fact that they have this formal policy-making power or decision power, as you say, which I think really makes them fundamentally different than commissions that can only have influence if they persuade someone to take up their ideas.
They really have more resemblance to something like fast-track procedures on trade, where you have Congress limits what it can do in terms of amendment and requires an up or down vote on the time scale,
right.
and it has the same effect of increasing the probability that something will be approved as proposed.
I think
on the continuum of things, it is not quite government.
Yeah.
Because it's a commission. But
Right,
it's also
right.
not quite commission because it's more than advisory.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if there's a kind of continuum here.
Yeah, well, had the Bowles-Simpson Commission gotten, what was it, 14 out of 18? What was the number it was required? Then of course, it would have moved toward being like the BRIC, in the sense that apparently its proposals would have come before the Congress for an up or down vote, I guess.
Well,
But I'm not sure that, could they have been amended, though?
It actually wouldn't have, because the congressional version of that, which the Senate Budget Committee had put together, failed. They did not get the 60 votes it needed in order to make that commission.
That's correct. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay, that's right.
But if you just look from a process standpoint, some commissions are more plugged into the decision process, and their conclusions find their way, and some are more divorced. And if you're going to have a continuum, there's the formal mechanisms for establishing the continuum. There's also just doing a functional analysis. And I don't. And your study is really a pioneering study. I don't even know if the most important taxonomies have been developed in this area of work. There's lots and lots of stuff that can be done. Shun?
I'm wondering, are there any interesting outliers that don't fit your predictions?
Well, one actually is the 9/11 Commission, because it was a commission created by Congress. We didn't really talk about this, but in general, I argue that commissions created by Congress are less successful than commissions created by the president, because congressional commissions usually have their members appointed by the leaders of Congress. And congressional leaders will have an incentive to appoint political partisans, people who are going to represent the party line. And as a result, congressional commissions usually don't reach consensus. They usually are like congressional committees, because you've got partisans on them. Whereas when the president appoints a commission, he or she, if she wants, can appoint moderates who actually would be likely to reach consensus. So the 9/11 Commission kind of bucked the odds, because they were able to reach consensus and preserve a tremendous amount of bipartisanship in how they carried out their work, even though most of their members were appointed by the Republican and Democratic leaders of Congress. So that's one outlier.
The woman in front, and identify yourself, please.
My name is Sarah June in the Foreign Policy Program, and I have a not-so-hypothetical question. Suppose Congress appoints a commission to look into a certain issue. How common is it for the president to appoint a second commission to look into the same issue?
Quite common. So a lot of these commissions, I think, are best seen in the context of games between Congress and the president, or a struggle between Congress and the president. And often members of Congress will create a commission to try to put pressure on the president or score political points against the president. And the president, at the same time, will often create commissions to try to get Congress to agree to some agenda that has resistance in Congress. And presidents will do things to preempt the establishment of a congressional commission often. They can do a couple of things. One is, if they see legislation brewing to create a congressional commission, they may create their own commission and say, we're already acting. Or they may do other things that will say, oh, there's no need for this commission because, look, we're already taking steps X, Y, and Z to address this issue. Or once the commission's already operating, sometimes the president will take steps to try to take the wind out of the sails of the commission. And they know the commission's report is coming, so they'll make a policy announcement that, oh, we're doing X, Y, and Z on this issue. And then when the commission reports, people might think, well, the president already acted on this issue. So I think there's often this kind of struggle between the president and Congress on these things.
So,
Bill Harder, I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Government. Just to kind of go back one question, and this finding that commissions created by the president are more effective, I'm wondering sort of, is that a function of sort of the policy adoption there can be adopted as a result of sort of unilateral actions and executive orders rather than legislative policy making?
It can be, and it is, as you suggest, always easier to adopt something that doesn't require legislation than to adopt something that requires legislation. But what's also important is that, as I mentioned before, presidential commissions are more likely to be able to reach consensus, and also they're much more likely to be able to get up and running and report quickly. And this is really important when there's a crisis, since I argue that commissions only tend to really have a big impact when there's a crisis. The president can appoint a commission immediately and appoint the members right away and order the commission to report within 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and the commission will do so. In Congress, it takes a long time to pass legislation to set up a commission, and then even once the commission is set up, the people have to be appointed by congressional leaders, and congressional leaders often will drag their feet and make those appointments, maybe because they don't want the commission to actually operate.
Which is still fundamentally an issue of unitary advantage over.
Right, that's exactly right. So
you can also have examples, though, of the Congress appointing a commission and the executive branch delaying making appointments. I think of one Bob Pastor and I were involved in called the Murphy Commission, back in which the Congress was unhappy about the sort of White House domination of foreign policy making under Henry Kissinger, and therefore created a commission which, as I say earlier, didn't have much in terms of policy impact, but generated probably the best ever research program on the foreign policy process, because they seemed to have a lot of money and they were able to generate a very wide range of studies that are now, alas, 40 years old, or 35 years old, but they're still on my shelf.
Boaz?
I actually don't have a question, but I have a suggestion for a title for your second book. You should call it Sins of Commission.
Sins of Commission. Excellent.
Very. So what is your next project going to be, Jordan?
Well, I'm starting a couple of new projects. One with my great colleague Sharon Weiner, who I guess has stepped out. We're going to do a project looking at the role and influence of Congress in foreign policy, which is a sort of long-standing topic of interest among people who study foreign policy. We have here at SIS a lot of people who are interested in Congress, like Mac, who's one of the best scholars who's written about the role of Congress. And then also we have, I'm going to do a project on strategic planning, so looking at government strategic planning efforts in national security policy. And this would be similar to my study of commissions, where I'm going to look at strategic reviews that get carried out by the government and whether they lead to real policy changes. So there's a proliferation of strategic planning exercises in the government, quadrennial strategic reviews, other kinds of reviews, and there's not really been research looking at whether these kinds of exercises lead to real changes. So that's next.
So I once had a colleague who always was writing very serious, terrific scholarship, and he was also writing in the morning. He would write what he called comic books, which were sort of satirical or funny essays about different things that were related to what he was doing. And I think you can't drop this topic that Boaz put forward. And The Sins of Commission ought to be the title of something that you write.
I have to look. It might be the title of a book written by one of the 9/11 conspiracy theorists, because there are a lot of people who think that commission was sinful in its work. So, but it's a great title.
Worse since the Warren Commission.
Great. Well,
let me just say one other thing. I think when this book, if people really read this book and really take it to heart, we're going to divide the analysis of commissions into two historic periods. One will be before Tama, and one will be after Tama.
Well, that's a very fitting way to end, and we want to congratulate you, Jordan, on opening us up to a new era, and we're all going to want to follow very closely what happens in this new era, especially with your scholarship. Congratulations.